Thank you very much and good afternoon. It was therefore necessary to posit some virtue on the part of the intellect, which would render the intelligibles into act, by the abstraction of the intelligible speeches from the material conditions. So Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologia, prima pars, question 79 at article 3. This is the conclusion posed by Thomas, in which he intends to demonstrate the necessity of the existence of an agent intellect always in act, which on the basis of the Aristotelian theory of knowledge can be called the cause, aition, and a productive principle, poietikon, of all things, as a disposition of the type of the light, since in a certain way light also makes the colors which are in potency into colors in act. In this sense, the great Renaissance commentators of Thomas, like Cajetan and Ferrariensis, held the existence and the need of the intelligible speeches to be self-evident, and their attention focuses and differentiates with regard to the relation between agent intellect and phantasm in the production of intelligible speeches. Their philosophical effort was directed accordingly, namely, towards the proper explanation of how the sensory representations are illuminated by the agent intellect. That's a quotation of Lenz Proit, Species Intelligibilis. The first to judge their heuristic and epistemological validity with regard to the genuine via tome is Domingo Báñez, a generation later, who examined and refutes many of the solutions tried to resolve the question, but above all focuses on those of Cajetan and Ferrariensis, the most recent and perhaps the most insidious, at least from his point of view. The question begins in Báñez University lectures in Salamanca, in the commentary on question 79 of the prima pars of the Summa Theologia in the article 3. In the light of the psychological doctrine and the critical remarks of Mondragonensis, we will therefore try to bring out their genuineness with reference to Thomistic thought. Briefly, I summarize the exegesis of Cajetan and Silvestri. Then I shall focus on counter-arguments of Domingo Báñez. Báñez goes directly into the specific solution adopted by Thomas de Vio, for whom, I quote, the agent intellect illuminates the phantasm objectively, not formally. Cajetan thesis, in his commentary to Summa Theologiae, question 77 at article 3, starts from the Aristotelian comparison between the action of the agent intellect on the phantasm and that of light, of colors, as I've said, which makes colors in potentia, colors in act. However, Gaetano, at this point, reformulating a statement of Aquinas, makes an original distinction, as Báñez quotes. The effect of light, effectus luminis, is twofold, that is formal, formalis, and objective, obiectivus. Formal means being illuminative, that is clear in the diaphanos. Objective, instead, means appearing, as it clear in color. Color, in fact, does not appear if it is not illuminated. End of quotation. In this way, in fact, not every determination of the entity extra animam mediated by the phantasma would appear, but only those universal characteristics that constitute the quod quid est of the object. In fact, according to Cajetan, the agent intellect, even without being inherent in the phantasm, is connected to the latter and exercise on it a merely extrinsic assistance, making only the intelligible contents emerge, non singularitas illius ei coniuncta and without principium individuationis. To remain in the same metaphorical milieu, the light of the agent intellect, in view of the production of the intelligible species, makes the intelligible visible, as in the case of color, which subsists as visible in potency in an entity, even when it is not illuminated. That is, illuminatio obiectiva. Lensproit recognizes in Gaetano's cognitive psychology the fact that he presumed the contents of our intellectual acts be grounded in physiological phantasm. And in the word of Carlo Giacon, I say, from Gaetano's words, it would therefore seem that the agent intellect will not modify the phantasm in any way, but living in its simple degree of materiality, will make only the common nature appear and not the singularity. And then it would seem that the phantasm could be either the beginning of the end or the end of cognition, while as such it can neither operate on what is spiritual nor achieve a spiritual act. Well, the reaction of Ferrariensis to the position of Cajetan. Ferrariensis, commenting the second book of the Summa contra Gentiles, politely highlights the thesis Tom starum quidam novam positionem ad invenientes is Cajetan, and reports pene adverbum the words of Gaetano. His judgment is completely pertinent and metaphysically profound, I quote. This position does not seem to be true, either according to St. Thomas or in itself, because, however much the phantasm is illuminated and enlightened, it is always in a bodily organ, and its representation is material and individual. Nature is not, however, in the phantasm formally, according to its natural being, so that by abstraction, one can consider in the very nature of the phantasm the universal nature, which is found in the singular represented by the phantasm, but it is found there only as representation, together with its particular conditions. End of quotation. To justify how the agent intellect with the phantasm elicits the intelligible speeches, the formal principle of intellection, Ferrariensis resort to a Dionysian principle in the Divinis Nominibus 7, as it was quoted by the father. Supremum inferioris attingit infirmum superioris. The substantial graduality and ontological harmony of the created universe is based on the hierarchy of beings without solution of continuity. If it is true that, as a scholastic commonly assumed, the same operative faculties are more or less perfect in beings belonging to different degrees of being, Ferrarese says, I quote, "The virtue that forms a phantasm in man, because it is rooted in the same essence of the soul with the intellect, is more perfect than the imagination of the brute, and therefore it produces more perfect and virtuous phantasm, so that, by their nature, they are able to cause, together with the agent intellect, the intelligible speeches in the possible intellect, something which would not be appropriate for the phantasms of the brute." If Cajetan objective illumination appears peculiar, even false in its presupposition and effects, Ferrariensis attempts to the path of a radical illumination, illuminatio radicalis, which constitutively determine the phantasm ab origine to express, together with the agent intellect, the intelligible speeches. In this way, therefore, the fantasy of man rooted in the same principle of the agent intellect, naturali concomitantia, produces a phantasm already ordered in itself to the production of the intelligible species in view of intellection. The illumination of the agent intellect on the phantasm does not consist in something superadditum and transitory, but structural and constitutive. In conclusion of this second point, we can agree with the deduction of José Ángel García Cuadrado, where he states, according to Ferrarese, the sensitive image receives an intrinsic strengthening that produces the spiritualization adequate for the reception of the intelligible species in the possible intellect. It is useless to imagine a particular action of the agent intellect subsequent to the generation of the image, since this already ab origine is found spiritualized. In this way, the notion of instrument that St. Thomas attributes to phantasm, with respect to the efficient cause, which is the agent intellect, seems to be obscured. Then, after this presentation of the position of the major commentators of the Renaissance of Thomas Aquinas, I want to demonstrate the counter-arguments of Báñez. Báñez begins contesting Ferrarese and say, phantasms are not said illuminated by the action of agent intellect, cause the union of the phantasm with rational soul. And then he continues. First, the species must be presented to the sense. Secondly, to the imagination. Thirdly, to the possible intellect, which is impressed by the species of phantasm according to the illumination of the agent intellect. In the imagination, then, there are not only the forms of sensible object properly, that the intelligible species is produced. Produci species intelligibilis, that is the quotation, which by its essence is intelligible in act. Certainly, the fact of attributing to the agent intellect a productive action through the instrumental causality of the phantasm could expose to the risk of a theoretical misunderstanding starting from the already Aristotelian difference of action in kinesis and energeia. Therefore, according to the Thomist tradition, between transitive or predicamental action, actio, and immanent or metaphysical action, operatio. While the former has as their terminus an effect outside the subject, the latter instead perfect the same agent, therefore without a real productio. Describing the beginning of the intellectual process as a productio of the species intelligibilis could lead to considering knowledge as a physical action, rather than the top of immaterial and metaphysical operation. Moreover, a representationist wound could also be opened, whereby one would have access to knowledge of reality in an indirect way or even in its absence, like Scottist model. Báñez himself dispels any reasonable doubt when he clearly states, I quote, "The thing that is known is intelligible in potency, according to the being that it has outside the soul or in the phantasm. But it becomes intelligible in act according to the intentional being, secundum esse intelligibile, which it acquires in the intelligible species by virtue of the agent intellect. It is said that the agent intellect makes something intelligible in act, not the phantasm, as has already been proved, nor the intelligible species, therefore, the thing that is known, rem que intellegitur. The agent intellect, in the final analysis, as the motor of the intellectual process, leads its operation to its own natural conclusion, that is, to the intellection of the extramental object. Only in a relation to this term, analogice dictum, can we speak of intelligible in potency, res secundum esse physicum, ed intelligible in act, res secundum esse intelligibile, while the intelligible species in itself is always in actu, by virtue of its ministerial function between the res and the possible intellect, which properly carries out the cognitive operation. God himself, states Báñez as a theologian, has established that in the intellectual process some elements have the function of representare, that is, making present in the mind the object of knowledge, but teach in its own way. The phantasm acts as a matter for the intellect, and so as an intelligibile esse in potentia. Note the species intelligibilis in potentia, un intelligibile esse in potentia, while the species intelligibilis is form and act, and therefore it is essentialiter intelligibilis in acto, produced for the efficient abstraction of the agent intellect. The productive abstraction, therefore, of the agent intellect qualifies as a noetic prerequisite to the apprehensive abstraction of the possible intellect in second act, and as a real operation in which the phantasm, with a ministerial function, is elevated by the agent with a transitory motion, qualitas vialis, to realize an effect superior to its nature, but which is given in view of the end per virtutem intentionis moventis. The relationship esse intelligibile in potentia and in acto, as has been said, in the dynamism phantasma species intelligibilis, through the efficient causality of the agent intellect, is still well summarized by the closing of this argumentative section by Báñez itself. I quote, "Since, however, the being which things have in the phantasm is in itself ordered to the intelligible being which they have in the intelligible species, and is as a potency to that, consequently, according to the being which they have in the phantasm, things are intelligible in potency. In potency. Things are intelligible in potency. And this potency can be actualized by the action of the agent intellect, which produces their intelligible species in the possible intellect, in which they have the ultimate and actual being of intelligibility." Then, a brief excursus about the instrumental causality of the phantasm, which is very important and very rooted in the mind of Aquinas. Even when, on the basis of Thomas' statement, both Cajetan and Ferrariensis postulate a certain logical and natural order between the action of the intellect acting on the phantasm and the actualization of the possible intellect, that's correct, Báñez correctly specifies that it preceded by a priority of causality, note of time. And there is no talk of the action with which the intelligible in act are realized in the phantasm, but the phantasms are assumed to produce the intelligible in act in the possible intellect. And therefore, the primary function of the phantasma clearly is instrumental, not possessing, not even in man, a virtus naturalis, nor a potentia proxima to the elicitation of the intelligible species, but only a sort of potentia obedientialis. This is Báñez no Suarez. To act as an instrument of the agent intellect. Even with some difference, the instrumental causality of the phantasm is supported by the Dominican Thomist school, Báñez underlines, faithful to the multiple indications of Aquinas himself. Báñez say, and so it is clear that the agent intellect is the principal agent which realizes the image of things in the possible intellect, while the phantasm, which are received from external things, are instrumental agents. This is the conclusion of St. Thomas, and this is also the common conclusion among the disciples of St. Thomas. This aspect of the instrumentality of the phantasm, however, following to court the Báñezian thought, does not seem to raise question of an epistemological nature on the one hand regarding the authentic virtuality of the instrument, on the other regarding the relationship between the latter and the agent. Extrinsic assistance by the agent, developed in particular by Fonseca, for example, is not the position of Báñez, but is a risk. In fact, in conclusion of the argument, Báñez highlights how each phantasm has its own virtus propria to produce the species intelligibilis moved by the agent intellect, and the phantasm has this excellent virtuality ex coniunctione ad animam intelectivam, which the agent intellect moves to produce an effect superior to it according to a subordinate causal action. I quote, "The phantasm is not only an instrument for producing the intelligible speeches, but also matter, from whose power the agent intellect elicits the intelligible speeches." End of quotation, specifying analogically that sensitive knowledge, not being the total and perfect cause of intellectual knowledge, rather function as materia causae. To support better the principle of the intrinsic operative virtuality of the phantasm as an instrument, certainly actualized by the agent intellect that moves it, Báñez specifies. Sometimes it happens that in natural things, the production of different effects comes not from the diversity of the principal efficient cause, but from the diversity of the instrument and from the different condition and disposition of the matter. The phantasm contributes to the production of the intelligible speeches, not only moving the possible intellect efficiently, but also determining the agent intellect to produce itself the intelligible speeches of a man or a horse because of the diversity of the phantasms. The phantasm, therefore, not only has an efficient instrumental causality, as stated in relation to the production of the species intelligibilis, but it also assumes a sort of material causality in order to determine ad hoc and not ad aliud the productive action of the agent intellect. Conclude Báñez, the phantasma are properly functional matter, materia ministerialis, of the intelligible speeches, not subjective as Cajetan wants, and at the same time they are also instruments of the agent intellect to produce the intelligible speeches. Even the determination of the agent virtue of the agent intellect for this effect, for example, the speeches of a man and not of a horse, comes from the determination of the phantasm used for this effect. End of quotation. Given that, therefore, the phantasm is materia ministerialis, instrumentum determinatum ad talem effectum, and causa concurrens elevated by the virtue of the principal cause, it must reject the hypothesis that the author is following at the thesis of the mere extrinsic assistance of the instrument by the agent, like Pedro de Fonseca believes, as he would be accused, for example, by the Augustinian Egidio de la Presentación or the Jesuit Juan Martinez de Ripalda. Báñez is very clear about these points. Instead, the agent intellect uses the phantasm as an elevated instrument and is determined by its object to produce certain speeches. So that we must consider that the phantasm must necessarily contribute to produce a certain intelligible species in the possible intellect, not only virtute propria, but receiving from the agent intellect a virtue per modum transeuntis, which elevates it to produce a specific effect. So adversus Ferrariensis, and now Báñez' criticism on Gaetano. It is not said that phantasms are illuminated by the action of the agent intellect, because the quiddity of the material thing, intelligible in act, would objectively appear in them. So Báñez. This is the synthetic negation of Cajetan thesis, already widely refuted by Ferrariensis, to whom Báñez willingly refers, and per consequence, the motivation of negation is made explicit, deriving it a fortiori from the doctrine of Gaetano himself, a sort of Cajetan adversus Cajetan itself by words of Báñez. I quote, "That object, under such abstraction, is not known by the cogitative, which is the most perfect power among the sensible ones, as Cajetan himself teaches, since otherwise the cogitative would know the intelligible in act, which is to know, and consequently the cogitative would be the intellect. And that object is not known by the intellect. The object of the intellect, in fact, must be immaterial, but that quiddity, even if it is under the effect of illumination, is sensible in being, since that quiddity, according to the doctrine of Cajetan, is in the phantasm himself. Therefore, the sentence of Cajetan is false." According to Thomistic principle and Aristotelian principle, which there must be proportion, logos, between the power and its proper object, if the quiddity of the material object that the objective illumination will bring out is to occur already present in the sensible image, it still remains not entirely immaterial, and it would therefore be the task of the most perfect internal sense, the vis cogitativa, to assimilate it, not of the intellect. But since immateriality itself is the ratio of knowledge, and the intellect itself is immaterial, an equally immaterial object is necessary in order to actualize the intellection as it is. As for Gaetano's assertion that the objective illumination of the agent intellect would give actuality to the intelligible that was potentially underlying the phantasm, Báñez further specifies his thought about the Aristotelian analogy between the action of light on colors and that of the agent intellect on phantasm as regard function and effects. First of all, in addition to the formal and objective function of light described by Gaetano, there is another that makes colors capable of moving the sense of sight, through the impression of colored speeches. Therefore, Báñez better clarifies the analogy of proportionality. I quote, "Our agent intellect is called light, although it does not have a proportion with external light as regard its formal effects, which are to realize the luminous and to make the colors appear, but as regard another of its effect, which is to give the efficient virtue to the same colors of being able to impress the sight, introducing the speeches into them." End of quotation. This statement seems to have in mind the Aristotelian description of the dynamism that is established between light, diaphanous, colors, and sensorium. In other words, in addition to the action that actualizes the diaphanous, making it luminous and capable of receiving the color, primary effect, in addition to then making the color visible as such, the secondary effect, light also has the property of conferring on the color that has become visible in act the capacity to alter the sense of sight, moving it to the specific function of seeing according to proportion. According to this relationship, therefore, the author establishes that the agent intellect has a function similar only to this latter, illuminatio effectiva. That is, I quote, "making this phantasm suitable for moving the possible intellect by means of the production of the intelligible speeches in it through the elevation of the agent intellect, which is called the illumination of the phantasm, insofar as it uses them as instruments for producing the intelligible speeches in the possible intellect. This constitutes the possible intellect in the act of knowing the material quiddity as intelligible in act, which before was only intelligible in potency, insofar as it was hidden under the singular conditions." This is what Báñez intends to grant to the doctrine of Cajetan. The abstractive illumination of the agent intellect on the phantasm really produces the intelligible speeches that actualize the quidditas rei materialis, which, before this operation, can be said in potency only if it is considered hidden sub singulare. Therefore, the phantasm itself acts as an instrument elevated by the agent intellect for the elicitation of the intelligible speeches, which is therefore absolutely immaterial, but in conformity with the object extra soul, since it proceeds from the dematerialized phantasm and capable of leading the possible intellect to the knowledge of the quiddity of the res. Ergo, ratione uius actionis dicitur illustrare phantasma. In other words, according to Garcia Cuadrado, I quote, "What Báñez does not seem to admit in that is that Cajetan affirms in the phantasm an actual intelligibility. The phantasm belongs to the sensible order and requires an intrinsic elevation that makes it pass to the intelligible order, thus being able to inform the possible intellect, and also avoiding the ambiguity of a status of the phantasm," I quote Garcia Cuadrado, "halfway between material being and intelligible being." I go to the conclusions. 4 conclusions. Báñez's discussion on intelligible speeches did not break any new ground. It harmonized the central tenets of Thomistic psychology with the then prevailing tendency to view the intellect as the privileged cause of its own immanent act. These are not my words, but of Leon Sprout, who liquidates Báñez's contribution to Thomistic psychology, in fact, downplaying not so much its originality, but its speculative depth. This, in the end, was precisely the aim of this study, to bring out the doctrine of the production of species through the subordinate causality of agent intellect and phantasm, in order to show the speculative solidity of Domingo Báñez. For conclusion, then, primo, Sprout acknowledges Báñez implicitly polemizing with traditional positions. This says that Báñez did not limit himself to reproposing in a more or less varied way the Thomistic thesis, but attempt a real hermeneutic operation of the sources of the Thomistic school, of which he explicitly, not implicitly, stigmatized the exegesis of two of the major exponents, Cajetan and Ferrariensis. Furthermore, his speculative study aimed at the correct sentire cum Thoma, which, if it has been the intention of all commentators, I think, has not always been updated in a properly faithful way, as in the case of Báñez. Secundo, the rectitude of the exegesis of the master of Salamanca, which respect to the men's Thomistic faithfulness that does not mean repetition or mere reformulation, but systematicity and speculative organicity, could be affirmed and demonstrated on several occasions. Here we recall only one decisive locus of Aquinas, which, with all evidence, explains Báñez's exegetical acquisition. I quote Thomas Aquinas, De Veritate, question 10, article 6 at 7. When the possible intellect receive the species of abstract things from phantasm, the phantasms are related as an instrumental and secondary agent, while the agent intellect is related as a principal and primary agent. And therefore, the effect of the action remains in the possible intellect according to the condition of both phantasm and agent intellect, and not according to the condition of one alone. And therefore, the possible intellect receives the forms as intelligible by virtue of the agent intellect, but as similitude of certain things from the knowledge of the phantasms. And so, the intelligible forms in act are not in themselves existent either in the fantasy or in the agent intellect, but only in the possible intellect. End of quotation of Aquinas. That the abstraction comes to converge for Báñez in a productio speciei intelligibilis now seems, in our opinion, a good example of how a concept of Aristotelian logic assumed by Thomas to explain the beginning of the cognitive process is in turn subjected to exegetical scrutiny of the philosopher in order to understand better how it acts on the sensitive image. And net of all the other interpretation, this one of Báñez regarding the abstractio productiva seems to be very respectful of the Thomistic noetic system, as John of St. Thomas well shows. Tertio, Báñez exegesis has had an authoritative Nachleben in the Neo-Thomism of the 19th, 20th century. If in the history of Thomas there has been no lack of followers of the illuminatio obiectiva of Cajetan. I'm thinking inter alios about Antoine Gaudin, or the Neapolitan Canon San Severino, and other followers of the illuminatio radicalis of Ferrariensis, as Cardinal Thomas Maria Zigliara seems to be. It is indisputable that mostly through John of St. Thomas and the Complutenses, the Báñezian position has had a certain prominence as the one most faithful to Thomas compared to others. I think, for example, to Gardel, Joseph Great, Edouard Hugon, Paul Zivek, and many others. In particular, Father Hugon, after having refuted and rejected the thesis of both Cajetan and Ferrariensis as the model of Báñez, alluding to John of St. Thomas, with unequivocal terminology, writes, I quote, "From what has been said, the phantasma must contribute to the production of the intelligible speeches. But being material, it cannot contribute by its own virtue to a spiritual effect. Therefore, it must receive from the agent intellect some virtue that elevates it. Therefore, the agent intellect places in the phantasm a certain transitive virtue, or a certain motion by which the phantasm is elevated to produce the intelligible speeches as an instrument of the agent intellect. And thus the phantasm and the intellect reciprocally influence each other." End of quotation of Father Hugon. And of my contribution. Ultimo, the analysis of the production of the species intelligibilis from the subordinate action of phantasma and intellectus agens contributes, per accidens, to the explanation of metaphysics of causes, according to the genuine Thomistic position. Báñez's speculation allows the means of Thomistic theory of asymmetric cooperation between two agents, one principal, the other instrumental, according to the perspective of the subordinate causality of two agents of different orders, which supposes a virtus propria and an operatio propria for the instrument that disposes it to act an effect that, however, surpasses it, moved by the intentionality of the principal agent. And the action and the effect is totus a utroque, secundum alium modum, Aquinas in Summa contra Gentiles, totaliter, whereby the same effect is attributed entirely to the instrument and also entirely to the principal agent, so that it is not inappropriate for the same effect to be produced by the inferior agent, the phantasm, and by the principal agent, the agent intellect, by both, without mediation, immediate, even if according to different modalities. Thank you for your attention.